They did it out of jealousy and call it your fault. That's how deception operates when truth threatens the insecure. The moment you started to shine, the envy disguised itself in conserving criticism, in false accusation. They couldn't handle your rising. They couldn't understand how you carried what you craved without begging for it, without compromising for it, without being like them to get it. So they made you the villain in the story they authored out of fear. You were not the problem, but you were the mirror. Your existence revealed the cracks in the character, the dust in their dreams and the rust in their discipline. And instead of growing, they choose gossip. Instead of healing, they choose hate. They couldn't stand how your presence made their excuses tremble. So they lied, they called your confidence arrogance. Your peace became irritation, your integrity a threat. And because they lacked the courage to confront themselves, they redirect the blame on you. When a person has nothing inside but insecurity, they will always twist your strength into something shameful. They take your anointing and try to paint its ambition. They take your favor and call it manipulation, because it hurts them to know that what you carry can't be bought, can't be copied, can't be fake. It was given, it was grown in silence, watered with tears, forged in fire. And because they didn't see the pain, they disrespect the power. Jealousy is not loud at first. It hides applaud. It shows up in support that secretly hopes you fail, just enough to feel human again. It sits quietly in conversations, pretending to care, while collecting details to twist against you later. That's what they did. And when you stood tall, when you didn't break, when you still kept walking in purpose, they blamed you for their own bitterness. They said that you shamed, but the truth is, you just outgrew the place where their egos ruled. Some people will never admit that they wanted your life, not because they love it, but because they hate that it's yours. You became the evidence that discipline works, that faith moves mountains, that God can take the rejected, the broken, the abandoned, and raise them up in front of the very ones who call them worthless. So they did it out of jealousy. And then they tried to rewrite the narrative to protect their pride. They wanted to make you feel guilty for not shrinking, for not giving them credit for what God did in you. But what they forgot is that purpose doesn't apologize. Favor doesn't explain itself. All doesn't ask for permission. You're not the villain in their broken perspective. You are the evidence that staying true to your assignment will cost you the crowd but bring you into alignment. Let them whisper. Let them be mislabeled. Let them fabricate. Because of time, the truth outlives the lie. The fruit silences the rumors. The consistency exposes the counterfeit. And what they thought would destroy your name only gave it more weight. You didn't just survive their jealousy. You matured through it. You didn't clap back. You climbed. You didn't stop. You soared. Couldn't kill what you didn't create. They couldn't bury what God called to rise. And so now your name is spoken in rooms their bitterness could never enter. Understand this. It was never about you. It was about what you reminded them they refused to become. They were angry because you reflected the version of themselves they abandoned. So you keep going. You keep building. You keep becoming. Because jealousy will always follow the trail of purpose. And when it shows up, don't bow. Don't dim. Don't doubt. Just let your light keep doing what it was born to do. Reveal. They don't truly hate you. They hate what you reflect back at them. They hate themselves. Your very presence became a silent confrontation, a loud question mark in the center of their comfort zone. You didn't need to speak. You didn't need to prove anything. Just by walking into a room with your authenticity, with your unshakable calm, you exposed what they were trying to hide. They unspoke doubt, their untamed envy, their buried regrets. You revealed how much potential they abandoned. You reminded them of every promise they made to themselves but never kept. That discomfort, they masked it as criticism. They rebranded it as dislike. But at the core, it was nothing but inner conflict projected outwards. You were never trying to make anyone feel small. You were simply choosing not to play small yourself. But those who rely on comparison for validation saw your courage as a threat. not an inspiration. They watched you evolve while they stood still. And instead of asking how you did it, they asked why you dared to. They interpreted your growth as arrogance, your boundaries as rejection, your confidence as rebellion, but in the truth, you were simply reclaiming everything life tried to convince you to surrender. It wasn't that you were louder, it wasn't that you were better, it's that you refused to dim anymore, and your refusal to apologize for who you are made them uncomfortable in the costume they were. You walked in truth while they were still rehearsing lies, and when truth shows up, it doesn't even need to argue. It just stands, it just breathes, it just is. And that's what shook them. They couldn't control you, they couldn't define you, they tried to diminish you. In rooms where fake connections thrive, authenticity becomes disruption. You were invited to make noise, you were invited to comply, but instead you brought substance. And substance unversed the shallow. They were fine with you as long as you were silent, as long as you stayed low, as long as you needed them to feel relevant. But the moment you started to walk in clarity, with purpose, with inner peace, their comfort began to shake. People rarely attack what doesn't threaten them. They don't slander what doesn't shine. If you had remained predictable, they would have remained polite, but you became undeniable. And that is when the tolerance turned into tension. Their support turned into sabotage. Their smiles turned into smirks. Because deep down they realized they had front row seats to someone doing what they said they do without the excuse they hid behind. You see, the light doesn't compete with the dark, it just shows up. That's what you did. You shine in the darkness. You showed up, keep going, keep becoming and doing. So you revealed who was walking with you and who was merely standing beside you, waiting for you to fail. They didn't know how to coexist without someone they couldn't outperform. So instead of celebrating you, breakthroughs, they silently wished for breakdowns. But what they didn't know was that your strength came from broken places. You didn't get here by accident. You bled for this peace, you suffered for this clarity, and because they didn't see the process, they resented the product. Your glow became from the grind. Your power was birthed in private. And now that it's visible, the ones who overlooked you are overwhelmed by you. But don't take it personal. They're not mad at you. They're mad at you make them feel about themselves. You are a reminder, the living proof, the walking contradiction to their excuses. And nothing provokes a person more than realizing they could have but didn't while you did. They could have while they didn't. They couldn't admit the envy, so they buried it behind false accusation. Instead of facing discomfort of their own jealousy, they reaches for the oldest defense mechanism in humanism. You became the scapegoat. They didn't want to name. They didn't say, I'm intimidated by your growth. They said, you change. They didn't confess. Your light makes me uncomfortable in my darkness. They accuse you of being arrogant. What they couldn't understand, they criticized. What they secretly wanted, they labeled dangerous. Because to admit that your evolution is real will force them to admit their stagnation is a choice. You didn't wrong them. You didn't sabotage them. You simply chose to heal, to grow, to elevate. But because they were stuck in a version of themselves they refused to outgrow, your elevation felt like an insult. So they had to twist your image to protect their ego. That's why they whispered your name in conversations, soaked in false concern. That's why they distorted your intentions to fit narrative that made them feel superior. They couldn't compete with your reality, so they started building lies that made you look like the problem. The strangest thing, how people can observe you silent, fighting through storms, quietly maturing through isolation, privately holding yourself together when everything inside was falling apart, and still say you got here too easily. They ignore your struggle, erase your sacrifices, overlook depth of your process, and yet feel qualified to define your character. But the truth is your inner strength threatened their story. You didn't break where they expected you to. You didn't react the way they planned. You remained composed while they tried to dismantle your name, and that drove them to take their jealousy and wrap it in false narratives that cast you as the villain. They couldn't understand how you remained kind after the betrayal, how you didn't clap back when they twisted your name, how you didn't explain yourself, didn't plead your case, didn't try to prove anything. That silence made them furious because they needed you to fall, to confirm the lies they told about you. But your consistency exposed their dishonesty. Your fruit contradicted their fiction. And instead of admitting they judge you too quickly, or that they judge you wrongly, they held tighter to the lie. Because when pride is louder than the conscience, truth feels like a threat. People who are driven by insecurity will always label your strength as something negative. Your peace will be called detachment. Your boundaries will be called ego. Your self-respect will label pride. Not because you are any of those things, but because they can't access the place you arrived at. And what they can't access, they criticize. They find a way to demonize what they secretly admire, because if they told the truth, they had to change. They had to look at themselves honestly, and honesty is expensive for people who are addicted to image. So they labeled you not to describe you, but to destroy the version of you they couldn't understand. They tried to shrink you into their level of comprehension. But what they didn't realize is that the real you is beyond words, beyond rumors, beyond whatever small box they try to trap you in. You've been stretched by pain. You've been reshaped by truth. And no lie, no label, no slander can reverse what you survived. Let them talk. Let them twist. Let them call you clarity, confusion. And you're calling chaos. You keep walking. Because those who can't see your heart will always question your hands. But your purpose will never need their permission to move. Keep being exactly what they can't define. That's what threatens them the most. Jealousy doesn't always come in the form of loud insult or obvious attack. It often dressed in politeness, wrapped in smiles, hidden behind subtle comments. It waits quietly, studying you, collecting information not to understand you, but to weaponize it when the time is right. It appears supportive until your success stretches beyond what they secretly hope for. That's when the shift begins. Not with confrontation, but with quiet resistance. The air changes, the tone shifts, the warmth fades, and suddenly the ones who once clapped for you now watch you with calculating silence. It's not always the enemy that shows jealousy first. Sometimes it's the ones close enough to call you friend, the ones who laughed with you, prayed with you, maybe even with you, helped you in your early steps. But when your growth reaches a level that outpasses their comfort, something in them shifted. Not because you wronged them, but because your evolution challenged the part of them they never addressed. You didn't boast. You didn't compete. You didn't even try to take their place. You just became more of who you were created to be, and that was enough to unsettle the hidden envy they were trying to manage quietly. Jealousy watches in silence, but it plans in details. It waits for the right moment, the right misunderstanding, the right weakness to exploit, not out of strength but out of fear, because someone who is secure has no need to sabotage what's growing besides them. Insecurity, however, is always on edge, always comparing, always second guessing, always looking for a way to protect its fragile sense of worth. And when your light shines too bright in that environment, it doesn't feel like beauty, it feels like exposure, so they become distant. Not always physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually. They stop celebrating your milestones. They ask fewer questions, give fewer blessings, respond with less joy. Then comes the subtle opposition. Backhanded compliments, changed tones, delayed responses. It starts small, so small that you question yourself at first. Maybe you're overthinking it. Maybe you're reading too much into it, but your spirit always knows discernment doesn't lie. There's a silence that speaks louder than any word ever could. Then come the whispers, not to you, but about you. What they once admired, they now mock. What they used to defend, they now distort. They discuss you behind closed doors. not to seek clarity, but to build a version of you that justifies their discomfort. It's not truth, therefore, it's relief. Relief from the pain of watching someone rise while they remain in place. And when jealousy matures in silence, it always ends up in sabotage. But it won't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like quiet disconnection, unexplained coldness, or passive withdrawal. And yet you keep walking, you keep growing, you keep choosing peace even when you sense the shift. Because you understood your journey wasn't about impressing people, it was about fulfilling purpose. You weren't competing, you were becoming. You weren't trying to win their approval. You were simply refusing to stay where you no longer belonged. And that silent jealousy, it couldn't survive in the light you were stepped into. Those silent watchers, those quiet critics, may never say that they were threatened. They may never admit they felt overlooked while watching you rise. But that doesn't change the truth. You didn't do anything wrong. You just did what they wouldn't. You confronted your pain, healed your wounds, stay consistent in your calling, and that made their delay feel like failure. Let them watch, let them whisper, let them wonder. Your job is not to shrink, to silence their jealousy. Your job is to shine in a way that invites them to deal with what's holding them back. And whatever they do or not, that's not your burden. You just keep walking with grace, with humility, and with quiet strength of someone who knows exactly who they are. They point fingers at you not because of you were guilty, but because you were present. You became the nearest target when accountability came knocking on their door. Instead of owning their own decisions, they redirected the spotlight and placed the blame on you to avoid facing what they didn't want to admit. You didn't fail them, they failed themselves. But taking responsibility would have meant looking in the mirror too long, and mirrors tell the truth. So they found it easier to craft a narrative where you were the reason for everything. They lacked the discipline to fix. You became the excuse. They needed to escape the pressure of self-reflection. Every time you succeeded without their help, it reminded them of how much further they could be if they had done the inner work. Every time you held your peace while they stirred chaos, it reminded them that emotionally maturity was a choice they never made. You were not the cause of their downfall. You were simply the contrast that made their patterns obvious. They made you the villain in the story that they wrote. They avoid admitting they stopped trying. You didn't ruin the relationship. They refused to grow with you. You didn't distance yourself to hurt them. You just outgrew the space where stagnation was acceptable. But to say that out loud would mean that they have to admit their lack of effort. Instead of they rewrote their truth in a way that kept them comfortable. You condemned. It's often easier to project than to process. When people are emotionally immature, they will cast blame like a shadow, hoping it lands on someone else before light exposes them. You were simply the most convenient one to carry the weight because you were strong, because you wouldn't retaliate, because your silence gave them space to feel right. They mistook your grace for guilt, your patience for permission, your composure for confessions. But deep down they knew. They always knew. They blamed you because your integrity revealed their inconsistency. You stayed true to when they wavered. You kept showing up when they disappeared. You honored the bond when they used it for convenience. And that type of consistency has a way of exposing what others try to hide behind charm, charisma. When your actions are steady and your character doesn't bend, it creates a contrast that some people cannot handle. They start to feel seen in ways they never asked to be. Instead of rising to meet your standards, they rather find faults in you to make them feel less responsible for not rising at all. The narrative was never about truth, it was about protection. They needed to feel safe from the guilt of letting themselves down, so they recast you as the problem. And when others asked questions, they had their story ready. You changed, you walked away, you stopped being supportive. But you and they both know you simply stopped accepting less than you deserve. You stopped carrying relationships where you were the only one pouring. You stopped apologizing for growing. And instead of admitting they had the same opportunity and chose not to take it, they turned it around and placed the blame on your shoulders. But you don't need to carry what isn't yours. The refusal to take responsibility It's not the reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their fear. The fear that they maybe had everything they needed to grow, but didn't use it. The fear that they maybe your rise is a mirror showing what they buried. And that fear is loud, but not your problem. Your peace doesn't need their permission. Your path doesn't require their approval. Keep walking in the clarity and let truth defend you in silence. They watch you receive what they secretly desired, and instead of being inspired, they grow bitter. Not because you took something from them, but because you received without begging, without losing yourself, without compromising the very values they thought they could abandon for a shortcut. You didn't chase the spotlight. It found you in your authenticity. You didn't demand recognition. It followed your excellence. And that unsettled them because they were convinced that you had to manipulate, networking, flatter, or perform to get what you now walk in with quiet grace. You became living proof that favor is not for sale, that purpose doesn't respond to competition. They wanted what you carry, but not the journey that built it. They saw the crown, but never noticed the scars beneath it. They admired the results, but ignored the discipline behind them. And when you started to walk in things they silently craved, jealousy crept into their thoughts. But instead of dealing with it, they disguised it as judgment. They called you a blessings, luck, your clarity, pride, your breakthrough coincidence, because accepting the truth that you earned through consistency, through obedience, through private struggles, will require them to admit they could have done the same. And that kind of self-awareness is uncomfortable. It's easier to question how you got it than to confront why you didn't. They didn't want your path, just your platform. They didn't want your growth, just your rewards. But the thing they resented in you were the very things they were unwilling to develop in themselves. You carried grace in silence, fought battles in secret, and stayed planted when it was easier to run. That strength didn't come from applause, it came from pressure. But because they didn't see your midnight tears or your quiet prayers, they dismissed your elevation as something you didn't deserve. They reduced your depth to appearance, your work ethic to luck, your resilience to image. Not because that's what you are, but because that's all they could comprehend. And what they saw as easy was really excellence, born from endurance. You didn't rise because you had everything. You rose because you stewarded what you had. And when doors opened, it was because you pushed them. It was because you were prepared when they did. They couldn't handle how favor shows you when they were busy trying to force it. They studied formulas, played games, sought shortcuts, and still couldn't replace the grace on your life. Because favor is not earned through performance. It's entrusted to those who are faithful when no one is watching, and you were. You didn't need the credit. You just wanted to walk in what was already yours, and that unsettled them even more. You moved differently. You didn't compete. You didn't copy. You didn't pretend. And that authenticity couldn't be fake. So instead of humbling themselves to learn from you, they turned away and mocked you. Not because you failed them, but because your success revealed their compromise. You reminded them of every moment they settled, every chance they had to rise, but refused to end. When people are not ready to confront their own missed opportunities, they begin to resent those who took theirs seriously. You didn't owe them your process. You didn't need them to justify what was birthed in you. Through pain, through prayer, through persistence, let them think what they want. Let them believe it came easy. Because those who carry favor know it never shows up without a price. And just because you didn't broadcast the cost doesn't mean you didn't pay it. You did quietly, faithfully, fully, and now they wanted without the work lives in your hands because you were willing to build what they only wished for. Not everyone is meant to walk with you through every stage of your purpose. As your calling deepens, your circle begins to shift. Not because you're arrogant, not because you're ungrateful, but because you have a purpose of demanding separation. There are places you are destined to go that cannot carry the weight of uncommitted company. Purpose sharpens you, and in doing so, it naturally cuts off what no longer aligns. Some departures are not betrayals, they are divine edits. When your vision expands, not everyone can handle the view. The higher you climb, the clearer you begin to see the intentions, the loyalties, and the quiet resentments that were easy to ignore at the lower altitudes. And in that clarity, you realize some people were never truly with you. They were just near you. Proximity is always partnership. Just because they stood beside you doesn't mean they were invested in your journey. Some were attached to your struggle, not your strength. They were comfortable when you were doubting yourself, when you needed their reassurance, when your light didn't threaten their shadows. But once you started walking in a new level of certainty, it made them uneasy. Not because you wronged them, but because they could no longer predict or control your path. Purpose reveals what comfort conceals. When you were unsure of your identity, you accepted relationships that mirrored your confusion. But when you started discovering your worth, when you began aligning with your assignment, you became more intentional. You stopped entertaining conversation that drained you. You stopped chasing validation from people who never truly saw you. And that decision alone disturbed those who only knew how to function when you were insecure. Letting go wasn't about bitterness. It was about breathing. It was about making room for people who don't compete with your healing, who don't shrink in the presence of your confidence, who don't feel personally attacked by your peace. As your purpose mattered, so did your standards. You no longer felt the need to explain your calling to those who only wanted to debate it. You no longer felt guilt for walking away from connections that requires you to betray yourself to maintain them. That growth cost your company, but it gave you clarity. While the separation may have felt painfully, it was necessary. Some people were assigned to your history, not your destiny. The role had an expiration date, and purpose made it known. The longer you tried to hold on to expired connections, the heavier your spirit felt. You weren't being punished by losing them. You were being prepared. Prepared to lead without applause, to walk without hand holdings, to trust God even familiar voices turned silent. Because purpose doesn't cuddle you, it stretches you, and that stretching circle will be refined. It will become smaller but solid. The loud voices will fade, but the loyal ones will remain. You will begin to attract those who celebrate your calling and not compete with it. Those who sharpen you, not drain you. Those who see your value even in your silence. And though it may seem like a lonely road at first, you will come to realize it's not loneliness. It's alignment. You didn't lose them. You found you. You found what your soul had been craving. Peace, direction, authenticity. And if it took walking away from temporary people to arrive at your permanent purpose, it was worth every step. Let them think you change. Let them say you're distant. But because the truth is you're finally close to who you always meant to be and to become. Lies may echo for a moment, but true walks with time, and time is silence, has a way of clearing the smoke. When they tried to discredit you, they thought their words would outlast your work. They assumed their whispers will stain your character deeper than your action could defend it. But truth doesn't scream, it stands. It doesn't rush to prove itself. It lets the fruit speak in seasons where noise fades and results remain. And while they were busy rewriting the script of who you are, you were quietly becoming everything they said you could never be. They underestimated the power of patience. They thought the lie would win because it traveled faster, but the favor is not in a hurry. It doesn't panic under pressure. It builds, it gathers, it deepens, it crafts stories in shadows. Your consistency began eliminating a different version of the narrative, one that wasn't shaped by heresy, evidence that couldn't be denied, evidence rooted in your character, your persistence, and your unwavering focus. The beautiful thing about purpose, it doesn't argue, it doesn't entertain distractions, it doesn't detour to correction every false version of yourself created in rooms you were never in. Purpose just keeps showing up, building what others said was impossible, bearing fruit that rumors cannot erase. And that's what you did. You kept showing up. You stayed faithful to your assignment. while they tried to discredit your name. And slowly, their noise lost volume because it lacked proof. Time began doing the work your words never had to. People forget the truth doesn't need to rush. It knows it will outlive the lie. They were hoping their words will break you, that their silence, their avoidance, their twisted stories will make you retreat into bitterness or defeat. But instead it made you bolder, quieter, maybe, but deeper. You no longer needed validation from people who only loved you when you were shrinking. You no longer waited for apologies, for voices never had the courage to ask for the truth before casting judgment. You let your fruit speak, you let your journey unfold, and while they tried to predict your downfall, they had to watch you rise. You didn't fight them, you outgrew them. You didn't argue with them, their lies, you drowned them in consistency. You didn't explain your every move, you let your integrity remain steady until the dust settled. And when it did, all that was left was the undeniable truth that you were never what they said. You were never the story they pushed. You were something stronger, proven, tested, refined. You were never the story they pushed. You were something stronger, proven, tested, refined. Let them tell their version. Let them cling to their assumption. Because eventually, even they have to face what they can't be denied. Truth may not go viral. It may not travel in gossip circles, not in conversation filled with biases, but it endures. It withstands. It prevails. And when it shows up, it doesn't apologize. It simply corrects everything that tried to bury it. They may never say they were wrong. They may never return to undo the damage, but that's not your concern. Your healing is not dependent on their honesty. Your calling is not weakened by their denial. And your character was never built to collapse. And under their misjudgment, keep walking, keep becoming, keep producing what can't be faked. Because in the end, when the voice fades and the mask fall, the fruit will speak. And no one will be able to deny what grew in the soul of your silence. You didn't fight back with bitterness. You didn't return insult for insult or meet pettiness with revenge. You didn't waste time proving your innocence to those who were committed to misunderstanding you. Instead, you rose quietly, consistently, elegantly. While they were hoping you'd lose your composure, you were building your peace. While they were planting rumors, you were planting roots. And it was that calm, that grace, that unnerved them more than any confrontation ever could, because nothing is more powerful than someone who doesn't need to clap back to confirm their strength. They were expecting a reaction. They were ready for you to spiral, to lash out, justify yourself in desperation. But you knew better. You understood that elevation doesn't argue, it ascends. And you allowed your progress to speak on your behalf. You let your actions become your response, your growth, rebuttal, your success, your silence. The decision was not weakness, it was wisdom. Because you were never trying to win an argument. You were focused on winning your peace. And peace isn't loud, but it is powerful. Some people thought you were soft because you didn't strike back. They mistook your silence for surrender.